All right, so it seems like we've got a good amount of people here. I'll go ahead and get started. So for everyone who's joining us, thank you so much. My name is Morgan, and I'll be moderating today's conversation about AI governance. Specifically, we'll be covering the steps companies should be taking now in these early days to ensure a strong governance foundation. If you're new to Transcend, we provide governance solutions for enterprise data, helping companies unlock new business opportunities with a unified governance platform for data privacy and AI. So joining me today are Ben Brook, Transcend's co-founder and CEO, as well as Brandon Wiebe, Transcend's general counsel and head of privacy. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. Ben, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. So I'm Ben Brook, Transcend's co-founder and CEO. I am born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and came to the United States for school, where I met my co-founder, Mike. We were both studying computer science together at Harvard, where we ultimately got very deeply into the topic of privacy. And long story short, thought that people should have data rights, and kind of around that time, GDPR was brewing, and we started building technical solutions for companies to basically build their delete button and wire that up into all of their data systems. Since then, we have become a large privacy governance platform, serving all types of use cases across data mapping, across consent management, across doing things like assessing risk, and most recently, we've been very much pulled in the direction of AI governance by our customers. So we are a Silicon Valley-based company. We have a lot of our early customers also being Silicon Valley sort of app companies, if you will. They have been pretty consistently bringing us into the room for this topic of okay, the generative AI, this is like a game-changing, sort of landmark shift in how things will work. We need to change the way our business works. We have to wire things up a little bit differently. We need to change and add to our products. We also need to change and add to our internal processes. And so we're just seeing a lot of very sort of a lot of excitement, a lot of sort of eagerness to run full speed at really fundamentally making changes and wiring up generative AI into the business. But the most common thing we're hearing is that we know we need to run fast to stay competitive, but with a lack of guardrails in place, we feel like we are unable to move at all because we know that there's just so many landmines here. And so this is something that I'm really excited about talking about today. This is something that Transcend has very much leaned in fully to with the launch of new AI governance products. And really, I think anybody in this space feels like they are currently building on moving plates because the whole ecosystem is just moving so rapidly. So I'm excited to just sort of get here today and just talk things through. We did a similar webinar a month ago. A lot has changed since then. And so I really feel like from now until at least the end of this year, every month is just going to be a different landscape. So excited to just have an open dialogue here with Brandon, and yeah, looking forward to it. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Ben. Excited to be here as well. My name is Brandon Wiebe. I'm general counsel and head of privacy at Transcend. And my background, so I've been at Transcend about a year and a half now. My background has been on privacy and product counseling for tech companies primarily. So before this, I was at Twilio and was lead product counsel on their AI, ML, and customer data tools. And then before that was at Segments and led the product and privacy function there. So I've been through the process of building out sort of a product counseling and full privacy governance function at these types of organizations. And I think there's a lot of parallels that we can draw on those types of projects for AI systems. One thing that we can talk about is sort of as we get into this, but I found particularly valuable in my practice is building product counseling and risk management functions that get really close to the technology and understand it at a depth that goes sort of beyond what most legal functions are typically structured to do. And I think as we dig into what effective governance of these new AI systems looks like, it's going to require sort of that level of technical understanding and integration, and sort of a combination of both organizational and technical measures baked into that process. So really excited to dig into the details here.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Definitely excited for this conversation, and I think we'll be having a lot of great insights. So we'll be organizing the session this morning into 3 main buckets. The first is AI legislation in the US and EU, what is already in play, what's coming down the pipe, and what people should be paying the most attention to. And then we'll move on to the hallmarks of an effective AI governance system. And then we'll zoom out a little bit to what AI governance looks like holistically, from those technical safeguards to policies to things like company culture. So I also want to point out the QA and the chat. If any questions come up during the session, as Ben said, we want this to be an open dialogue. So please feel free to drop them there, and we'll make sure to get those answered throughout the session as well as at the end. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So I'll go ahead and dive in. So, when we were talking about this in our prep session and in the last session we did on this, Brandon, one of the things that you brought up was that there's all these headlines about the AI being this unregulated Wild West, but there are actually several laws on the books already that impact AI right now. So can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because we talk about how unregulated AI is and how regulators are sort of rushing to get their hands around all of the risks, the new risks that are presented by particularly generative AI that has cropped up in the last year or so. And, I won't debate the merits of whether a sort of more comprehensive, technically thoughtful set of regulations around AI makes sense or not. But I will say that in many respects, generative AI systems are regulated in a lot of ways. And we can look to sort of several bodies of law already and see that there is legal risk and regulatory risk that exists today. So I'll give a couple of examples. Starting on the intellectual property side, there is certainly a lot up in the air when it comes to IP, and particularly around who would be responsible for infringement if an output from a generative AI tool ended up infringing on a third party's intellectual property. But we do know at this point that the output of AI systems is probably not copyrightable on its own. We have an opinion from the Copyright Office. They are taking further comments on this. We also have a federal district court case that agreed with the U.S. Copyright Office's stance on this. So I think we're getting some more clarity around this. We can also look to just sort of basic IP law to begin to understand what the risk topography looks like if we're using generative AI tooling to do things like develop code for our products, for example, or put out works into the ecosystem for marketing purposes or things like that. But we can get a pretty good sense already about what we will be able to own as creators and where risk of potential infringement actions might come in. The other big one that is probably obvious to a lot of folks who are joining here is privacy, right? So we have, I think, 13 now comprehensive state privacy laws in the United States. We have many comprehensive privacy laws around the world. GDPR still tends to be the high watermark that we talk about a lot. And GDPR itself, beyond just regulating the processing of personal information, which is something we need to be aware of anytime we're using generative AI systems or any type of AI system, is the GDPR has requirements around automated decision-making as well that sort of go beyond the basic scope of personal data protection. And so these are requirements that you perform a risk assessment if you are engaging in automated decision-making that processes personal information. There are requirements that organizations take steps to ensure that AI systems are fair and non-discriminatory. Organizations have to provide users with information about how their personal data is being used in AI systems. So we can look to GDPR for a lot of guidance on how to begin to ascertain risk on new generative AI systems that we're putting in place. The other one I'll mention is under CCPA with the CPRA amendments. There are new requirements around being able to opt out of automated decision-making. The California Privacy Protection Authority is promulgating regulations in this area right now. It is still early days here, but we do expect sort of more thorough draft regulatory text to be coming out probably before their next board meeting. They've already issued some regulatory text around risk assessments, which touches on AI and automated decision-making. So we can begin to look there. They have not started the formal rulemaking process yet, but that is a good place for us to start looking. I'll mention two more, and then I'll stop talking for a second. There are regulations on the books now that regulate things like fraud and deceptive practices, where output of AI and the sort of risks that people are concerned about when it comes to AI, trustworthiness, bias, deception, those sorts of things, those may already be regulated under things like the FTC's Section 5 authority. So the FTC probably has what it needs to begin to look at, fraudulent output from generative AI systems or deceptive output. The other one that came up is, I think it was in the last SEC commission meeting, they indicated that to the extent that there is generative AI output that suggests fraudulently suggests things that could impact the markets, that the SEC will use its ability to enforce, fraud on the market and that sort of thing, to go after the human creators behind that output. So the folks who are behind that, they don't need any sort of additional deepfake legislation or anything like that to be able to go after you. The upshot of all of this is that there is a lot on the books right now that already governs things like how you process personal information, how you are going to handle bias and deception and trustworthiness in your AI systems. And so being aware of these things right now is important, and we don't have to wait for fully comprehensive federal legislation in this area.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. And, with all that said, you've gone over the laws that are already in play, but there are new laws coming down the pipeline as well, most notably the EU AI Act. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, I can give a little overview of the EU AI Act, and then I'll flag a couple of other things that are percolating through the legislative process right now. So in the EU, there is a proposed EU AI Act. This is the world's sort of first comprehensive legislation that is aimed to directly regulate the use of artificial intelligence. So the way that this is structured is it tries to classify AI systems based off of a hierarchy of risks. And for systems that fall into a particularly high-risk category, the Act bans them as being sort of an unacceptable level of risk. Then there are lower tier categories. So you have unacceptable risk, you have high risk systems, and then you have sort of low risk or no risk systems. Each of these different tiers, based off of the classification standards that are in the Act, would come with additional requirements that businesses would have to engage in. So higher levels of risk assessment process before you can release this, and then the consequences for breaching the AI Act can be pretty severe. You may have to turn over, your entire training sets or the algorithms behind your AI tool. This is still being fleshed out. So I think the key point to take away from this is it is going to be a risk-based set of legislation. And so having a good governance structure in place that is able to help you classify your AI tools based off of risk and then take steps to mitigate those if you think they are falling into higher risk categories is the way you should be thinking about building that governance framework. The process right now in the EU is that the three major branches of the EU legislative process have proposed this bill. They all have different sort of versions of their text. And they're now engaged in what they call the trilogue process, which is where they get into an informal conversation about the differences and try to align and then finally pass an aligned piece of legislation. That next step in the trilogue process doesn't happen until October. So we'll have movement probably next month after that, but don't expect anything before then. So in addition to GDPR, in addition to the EU AI Act, on the US side, there is some early movement, both at the state level and the federal level around AI. So I mentioned in California, the CPPA is hammering out some definitions and sort of the scope of applicability of different thresholds for when regulations around automated decision-making and risk assessments of AI tools might come into play. We expect that we will get a more fulsome draft of these regulations before the next board meeting, and they are going to continue to hammer these out. It will probably still be a while even after they start the rulemaking process formally and then finalize rules for these to become enforceable. So it'll probably be, I would say, at least another year at this point. On the federal level, there is some movement around AI legislation. So Senator Schumer started some AI listening sessions, went around and talked to leaders at AI and tech companies in this space. There does seem to be general consensus that a broad bipartisan framework for a US AI Act is possible. Senator Josh Hawley and Senator Richard Blumenthal have proposed a framework around this area as well. And then we see a lot of states beginning a similar sort of listening session, a legislative process to begin to ascertain the risks or what an appropriate legislative framework might look like for AI systems. So there is a lot in the works, and it'll be important to track this, not necessarily because enforcement is going to start soon, but because as you're building your governance frameworks now, getting a sense of where that legislation is going will be a good way to help you sort of frame up that conversation and build that internally.
Yeah, I'll just maybe add one or two things on there. I think the sense right now at the federal layer is that there's not going to be any immediate regulation that will pass as a result of Schumer's sort of listening sessions. I think right now, like it feels like there's a few lawmakers there's like a section of the lawmakers who feel like they're starting to get clarity out of the listening sessions on like what this is and like how to deal with it. And then I think there's a majority who's still like very green on the subject. And I also have the benefit of just being in DC this Monday and getting to speak with some folks on the Hill. And I think there's a very specific sense of like right now we're totally in the listening phase, and like we don't see there being anything likely to be passed, sort of similar to the sense of like privacy being close but not quite there. And I think there's a lot of just confidence in existing law, as Brandon outlined. The FTC has clearly said that they feel confident about being able to regulate AI companies in this existing, with their existing set of laws. So much so that, I was at a talk in April with an FTC regulator, and he was basically like maybe a little bit boisterous and said like, we don't need any new laws. We're good. We have everything we need. And so I think that's I think from the federal point of view, I think there's comfort in knowing that the majority of risks will have some sort of existing law and regulatory framework that they could that they can actually regulate enough. I think the one thing that feels like the biggest gap from the federal government is obviously any privacy issues. They have very little ability to regulate on the front of privacy because, as we all know, there's no comprehensive federal privacy law. So a lot of folks are sort of saying the first step to actually regulating AI would be to pass ADIPA or a similar sort of federal comprehensive privacy law. And so I heard that a lot. And then the other thing to note, just on Hawley and Blumenthal, Senators Hawley and Blumenthal, they're also looking at an amendment to basically carve out protections for AI companies under Section 230. And so there's a bill that they have, a bipartisan bill, to basically clarify that Section 230 would not apply to AI companies. Now that's an early bill. It's not necessarily going to pass. It's also, even if it weren't to pass, I think there's a very real open question about whether Section 230 would apply anyway. I think there's sort of a legal fight that would have to happen there to clarify that, mainly because the sort of question at hand is generative AI like a sort of content creator, or is the AI company purely like a platform and sort of publisher? And so there's kind of a lot going on like these smaller fronts. And I think the current expectation is that, like, as usual, Europe will come out like with much more modern data policy, like much earlier than the US federal government. And we may even see a similar pattern of US states passing their own laws. And then, maybe someday the federal government will come around to it. My hope is actually that they start with a comprehensive privacy law. But as we all know, like, we very much like Congress will very much legislate based on like what's in the news cycle as well. So right now the talk is all about AI, but I think over time it will sort of settle back into like probably starting with something that's a little bit more based on like the privacy issues. One other thing that's worth just like checking out if you haven't already is the rights-based approach that the White House has posted, which is basically a sort of blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So like if the EU AI Act is very sort of risk-based, there's also a sort of way of legislating around like in preserving individual rights and making sure that we're preserving things like privacy and sort of safety. So those are my only two adds there.
Thanks, Ben. That's definitely it's definitely insightful, especially since you are in DC right now. So have your ear about as close to the ground as it can get. I also wanted to call out really quickly that Ben mentioned Section 230, and that is part of the Communications Decency Act, which in broad strokes provides immunity for online computer services in regards to the third-party content generated by their users. So we do have a couple questions, but before we dive into that, I want to make a distinction really quick before we get into some of the discussion on AI frameworks. And that's the distinction between predictive AI and generative AI, because they are quite different, and it should inform the way you look at frameworks and even these laws that are coming down the pipe. So Ben, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah,
for sure. So we have some really great frameworks that are starting to be published or have already been published. Like we have the OECD framework. We have the NIST AI risk management framework, which was published this year. I personally think that NIST framework is like an incredible document that if you haven't read it, you should. The one thing that I think is worth noting is that most of these were started before the sort of generative AI boom, if you will. And so a lot of it is slightly more focused on traditional predictive AI, where we're talking about things like systems that are basically predicting a value based on past data and basically predicting some sort of output rather than sort of creatively generating new content. And so things like copyright and IP and things like that are just like less of a consideration in predictive AI, where really it's sort of like much more rooted in things like algorithmic decision making and bias and fairness, explainability and things like that. So you can basically say like the AI we knew before maybe like early last year was essentially all predictive AI. And that would be the stuff that would be like basically predicting some result from a training set. And then generative AI is, ChatGPT and DALL-E 3 and Midjourney and all of these things which are making new written documents, new images, and really anything that humans create, we can sort of extrapolate and say AI will be able to create too. And so it's an important lens when looking at any of the risk management frameworks. I think for what it's worth, NIST does hold water on the generative AI front, but it's just less, like it wasn't started when the generative AI boom happened. And so I think if there's like a sort of next version, it will probably have much deeper and more sort of first class support for the generative AI risk management. Yeah, so just an important distinction, I think, to start with whenever having conversations about AI governance is like, which type of AI are we talking about? Because the risks that follow will be pretty fundamentally different.
Thanks, Ben. So Brandon, I'm going to send this one to you to just give us a couple more details about these frameworks, because as Ben said, the way they will be applied likely in the future might differ when you're talking between predictive and generative. That said, I think they do provide a really great foundation to start thinking about the risks inherent to AI and how you can mitigate them going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I'll just pick up on a thread that Ben was saying, which is, and NIST has been very clear about this, that their framework is meant to evolve over time. And so the version they released was truly a 1.0 version of that framework that was indeed started before generative AI had really taken the microphone, so to speak. And so I suspect that in further iterations based off of community feedback and their own internal writing, they're going to update these. So just talking about both the NIST AI risk management framework, and then some folks have heard of this OECD framework for the classification of AI systems. So the NIST AI risk management framework is a framework that is meant to provide a systematic approach to identifying, assessing, and mitigating the risks of AI systems. So it's organized around 4 core functions. This is map, measure, manage, and these sort of all feed into this govern concept. So this is, I would say, a good framework for thinking about the tactical process of evaluating and governing AI systems, and then documenting and cataloging risks, establishing technical controls to govern those risks, and taking steps to mitigate those risks. And really, when we're talking about governance, I try to simplify this a little bit in my head, because the concept of governance frameworks can seem somewhat overwhelming, especially if you've not implemented one before. I think the outcome or the purpose here is to establish sort of predictable and repeatable processes in your organization that are going to allow you to be able to identify risks and then take action on those risks. So it may be you identify a risk and you're fine with it. Your business is fine with it, but it's gone through a process so that you can repeatably come to that same conclusion each time you see that risk. Or you come across a risk that is not acceptable to your business, and you have a process in place to mitigate that risk, to put in some sort of control in place that's going to lessen the chance of that occurring or lessen the impact of that occurring. Or you have a process that just says we cannot move forward with this tool or this system based off of this risk. It's unacceptable. So that is really what the NIST framework is about, is putting in place that repeatable process so that you can identify and mitigate these risks. The OECD framework is a classification framework that helps describe and classify different types of AI systems. So I would say it's more of a way of giving folks a way to think about the possible impact and the way that AI systems interact with other parties in the world. So that framework has 5 dimensions to it. It has people and planet, which evaluates the potential impact of a system on individuals and their environment. It has economic context, which is takes into consideration the economic environment in which the AI system is employed or deployed. It has a data and input component, which looks at the data that is being used to train and operate the system. It has a model component, which evaluates the technical characteristics of the AI model. And then it has a task and output component, which evaluates the task that the AI system is designed to perform and the output it produces. So these are like different lenses that you can use to evaluate an AI system and begin to understand it better. And that can play a role in understanding and implementing a governance framework and evaluating risks as well. I would say, practically speaking, both of these frameworks are meant to be flexible, that can inspire and inform the way your organization establishes its own AI governance processes. So when you're looking to establish sort of the more technical or tactical steps, I should say, the NIST risk management framework is there to be flexible, and you can pick and choose the pieces of that as you're implementing the system. If you're analyzing and classifying particular AI systems, the OECD framework is a good guide as well. And then on top of that, we already mentioned the EU AI Act, which has AI system classification tiers in it. That can also be a good thing to think about as you're beginning to draft a process internally to govern systems. You can bake that into the way that you might classify risks for your organization as well.
Awesome, thank you. So we do have a question that I think is really relevant for this, and that's, are you saying a company should use different frameworks for the different types of AI?
That's probably best for me, I think. I think the actual reality is there's not really a framework that's dedicated to generative AI. So in the near term, the answer will be no. Now, I think in the medium/long term, the answer will be that the singular framework that you use will be updated to more sort of natively include generative AI. So it should be the same framework ultimately. So I like right now, I think best practice is likely to just use the NIST framework for now. I caveat that saying that NIST is obviously a US federal body, and maybe sort of US centric, whereas looking at like the OECD or looking at EU AI Act is likely to align more with like the regulation that will inevitably come first. So I would still be looking at both rather than sort of just picking one. But I think I think the NIST framework is kind of the most practical thing that you can go like read through and start working off of today. And so if anybody asks me like, how should I start my risk management process, I just say use the NIST framework.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. So we did have another question that.
Sorry. And then just
Oh.
Hugo, I completely agree. NIST has a lot of respect. The other thing that NIST has great respect for, which is very convenient for risk and privacy people, is that NIST has a lot of respect from technical personas as well. So engineers like recognize and know NIST as well. And so if you're going to your developers and saying like, hey, we need to like basically put these risk management controls in place around this AI system, this is NIST, it actually brings a lot of credibility to that sort of technical persona who knows NIST very well from existing engineering processes. So completely agree that they're well respected overseas as well.
Awesome. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to get into more of the practical parts of AI governance. So Ben, I know this is something that we've talked a lot about, you've thought a lot about, but can you walk us through your perspective on what's required to create an effective AI governance system?
Yeah, for sure. So we spent so far a lot of our conversation on public policy, on risk management, on a lot of these sort of like first framework type steps that we should be like understanding the universe in. So a lot of this stuff is great for getting like our terminology in place, getting a solid sort of understanding and like orientation within the world. Now, I think we're going to start shifting this conversation toward much more practical, like day zero, first 90 days type of measures. And the thing that we are seeing a lot with our customers is the need to basically like start adopting technical controls and technical measures, which actually mitigate risk on the ground and start putting guardrails around what, for example, an engineer might be able to do with, for example, a large language model, right? So in your business, you may have many different engineering teams building many different integrations with various large language models. And one thing that we see very commonly is like, there's really just no like central operation here. And so there's a lot of like, there's kind of this spaghetti of like, this team is building that integration with this LLM with this use case, and that team is doing this. And there's very little visibility to a risk team. And so, one of the first things you could do with AI governance is like, let's actually clean this up and make sure that we have some sort of central process where we can have an architecture that future-proofs us and allows us to actually send all of our communication with an LLM through a sort of singular layer where we can, audit things, where we can monitor things, where we can enforce policy. So really that sort of first core step that we see is like the need to start with a hygienic approach. And now this actually is, I think, a great point to contrast this with like what it feels like to work in privacy. So in privacy, the vast majority of us in the audience today or in this room today are dealing with systems that existed well before GDPR, well before we had modern sort of conceptions around privacy, and frankly store and share personal data in ways that makes it much more difficult to govern today. And so a lot of our jobs as privacy pros is like really retrofitting like hundreds, if not thousands of systems and vendors into this new sort of paradigm of personal data as a special class of information that we need to be able to govern, that we need to be able to understand and map and be able to do things like delete people across all of our data stores. Those are like extremely challenging problems because they existed before all of these modern paradigms in privacy. Now, we are at a very important juncture with AI where we have the ability to build the architecture that makes it very easy for us to govern it across our whole business for the future. And so it's sort of like, the thought exercise is like, what if GDPR was invented in like 1995? Like we would have architected our businesses and our data systems so differently. And so we are kind of in that moment right now with AI. And so architectural hygiene is a must if you don't want to like, jump onto another hamster wheel of like trying to govern all of the systems and sort of play like whack-a-mole. And so by having a sort of central layer through which your businesses talk with generative AI models like an LLM, for example, by having that all talk go through a sort of man in the middle like proxy layer, you are able to then have a single place where you can set policy for your company. And so if there is a company baseline policy, perhaps you say, you know, we're never going to put sensitive health information into a large language model. That's our policy. So you may have that written in a handbook today, but what if you actually want to enforce that? Or what if you wanted to know each time that actually happened with any of your integrations or any of your systems? There should, by having this central layer, you can literally just say, okay, we're going to make that a rule. And globally, across all of our various integrations, we can have this rule apply. And we don't need to, you know, knock on, you know, 100 people's doors to get them to implement this policy on an individual basis, but rather this central system through which all chatter goes, we can have this policy set. And so then you start getting things like auditability. You can have consistent monitoring, consistent sort of logging around all of the chatter that goes in and out to an AI system. So if you ever needed to respond to an incident, if you ever needed to, you know, get into the weeds of a support ticket gone wrong or whatever that might be, you have a consistent searchable audit trail. And so that's kind of the second tier of like what our customers are and really businesses on the whole are looking to get to, is like, we want consistent auditability across all of our usage of AI. The third is then, of course, monitoring. So we start taking that policy, that sort of employee handbook that may have been updated to say, here's what we don't send to generative models. And we start saying, okay, we want to monitor for every time we're sending credit card numbers, social security numbers, other sort of sensitive financial or health information, sensitive personal information. We want to actually be aware of all of that, of any occurrence of that happening. And so we should get a ping if an engineer is wiring up confidential documents to this new model. And so that's the monitoring and alerting step. Can we actually have like more specific policies? That's not, you know, the sum total of all audit logs, but rather a very targeted set of things that we listen for, such that we can start building up a sort of dashboard of risk, where we have across our clients, you know, some that are green, some that are yellow, some that are red, right? Now, then moving sort of further up here, we have policy enforcement. And so you may want to eventually get to this place where you don't just want to know that a credit card got sent to this third-party LLM. What you really want to do is prevent that from happening in the first place. And so that is where you can actually have policy and enforcement. And again, by having this architectural hygiene and having a man in the middle that is proxying all of your communications with a generative model, you can actually say, like, we're going to block that message if it has a credit card number, or maybe we're going to replace the credit card number with synthetic data and allow it to go through. Conversely, if you have a response, and this is let's say a chat model that is a support bot and it's end user facing, you may want some rules on that, right? There may be some things you just don't want to say to your end customers. That might be anything from expletives and inappropriate or toxic content, all the way to, we just don't want to talk about our competitors to our customers. And so again, you can have these policies that say the responses from LLMs and those generations should also have rules. And then ultimately, like the sort of dream state I think all of us want is like a single pane of glass where we can see all of our risk across all of our AI systems, and just be able to say, like, okay, there's a new AI system here. These are the categories of data it's sending. These are the types of responses it's sending. These are the policies that we want to set for that client, and be able to actually be on your way. And that is like what we view as the technical way to govern. And so, yes, we have risk management frameworks. Yes, there will be regulation. Yes, there's existing regulation. But like in practice, to implement this is the type of stuff that companies should be looking at adopting on a technical layer, so that there are real boundaries for how engineers are integrating, and rather than having to memorize and sort of like loosely follow a handbook, like building these boundaries that they bump into if they try to send the wrong type of data or something like that. And so you need both. You need the risk measures that exist in like the NIST RMF, because this is how you actually understand, and like on a very human level, understand potential risks around things like bias or accuracy or privacy or security or product safety. And then the technical measures are how you actually manage that risk on a practical layer. And so this is how we view the world. This is how we are helping our customers actually implement these controls. So this is something that in the first sort of 90 days of generative AI, I like to think that you should find yourself somewhere around the third layer of the pyramid, and hopefully then getting up to number 4 and number 5. And so this is very much like basically what I do all day is helping our customers do that. So this is very much like my sort of worldview on how to effectively govern AI.
Thanks, Ben. So we've got just a couple minutes left, and Brandon, this next one will be for you. So clearly the technical safeguards are critical to effective AI governance, but is there anything else companies can and should be doing as they look to deploy AI safely and responsibly?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm in total alignment with Ben that we are at a stage right now where we have the opportunity to build technical controls at the outset of adopting this technology, right? And it's a huge advantage from where we were when we were, first building the internet 20 years ago. That said, it will take some time. We should be thoughtful and diligent about how we're implementing those technical measures. And as Ben was saying, those sort of Venn diagram or nest neatly into broader organizational measures as well. So there are things that organizations can implement today to begin to build out a risk framework. I'll talk about just a few of those, but again, I'll mention that the point of this is not to have necessarily, a 100-page comprehensive sort of NIST-worthy governance framework in every single organization. It has to scale to your organization and the risks that you care about. And the point is that all of these different organizational tools that I'm going to talk through are meant to be able to repeatably and predictably identify risk, right? And help control and mitigate that risk. So one thing that I've seen a lot of organizations do is begin by implementing a code of conduct around AI, and in particular, generative AI. This does a couple things. One, it gives you at least a policy internally that can be enforceable, that can lay out some rules of the road for employees who are using generative AI at work, and say, here are tools that we are always okay with you using. And here are the use cases that we're okay with you using those tools for. Here are some things that are never going to be acceptable. And so we are saying, as a matter of policy in our business, we are not going to allow those. So this becomes enforceable as any other code of conduct would. And so it's one measure you can use to help guide behavior and influence behavior at your business. But I think it also sends a really strong signal internally to your business that you are comfortable with artificial intelligence. You understand it, you've taken some time to vet it, and you are giving the green light to certain types of activities that are pre-approved, rather than completely banning the use of generative AI, which we've seen some organizations sort of take that stance because they don't feel they can fully grasp and grapple with all the risks. The problem with taking that more draconian approach is that you are still going to get individuals using generative AI at work. It is very hard to, at this point, say or put in place technical measures that are going to stop people from, for example, going to ChatGPT and using a personal account. Giving them something with the imprimatur of the company that says you can go ahead and use ChatGPT, through our enterprise account with OpenAI, and adding that to your code of conduct makes people feel comfortable. It's going to help them engage with this. It's going to teach them the technology and also teach them how to be safe with it, right? So that's one thing as a code of conduct. The other piece that I would recommend as a sort of foundational layer in any governance framework is adopting a risk assessment process. So at Transcend, we've put together a sort of a full AI risk assessment available through the Transcend platform. We based ours on NIST and the EU AI Act, and a number of other guidelines that were out there. But this is really meant to be, like other risk assessments, a place where you can collect information about new AI systems and evaluate that information to identify particular risks, and write down in a single central location what those risks are, why they are okay or not okay, and what steps you're going to take about the ones that are not okay. At its core, that is the point of this. And it's a good first step to begin to get a sense of what systems are out there, what are the use cases for these systems, how is my business using AI, and begin to identify and catalog the risks that your business might be carrying with these AI systems. So those are the sort of two pillar or foundational things I would recommend. I do think, in addition to code of conduct and risk assessments, employee training that goes along with these, that describes how to use these, is going to be really valuable. And then the last thing I'll mention is, bias in AI output is a big concern and one of the major risks presented by AI systems. And so thinking about DEI and workplace diversity as you are building the teams that are developing your AI tools and developing the models is going to play an impact, or is going to have a big impact on the way that those models are built, the data that gets included, and having a diverse set of perspectives will begin to identify potential bias in models early on, so that you don't have to clean that up on the back end after a model is built. So I'll flag diversity in the workplace as an organizational measure that has sort of a technical impact downstream.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Brandon. So we do have a couple minutes, and that's lucky because we do have a couple of questions. The first one I want to start with, Ben, I think would be for you. Audrey asks, would this framework work for individuals on company devices using web browser versions on LLMs? It feels like rogue use of browser versions of LLMs is a hard thing to govern.
Yeah, great question, Audrey. That's correct. It will work with that type of use case as well. I will say all of the shadow IT problems that existed before generative AI exist in the context of generative AI as well. And so there are there's sort of a general need to, in my view, do two things. One is actually maybe three things. One is make very clear that people cannot be pasting proprietary company information into any consumer product, including generative products, consumer version of ChatGPT or Chat PDF or anything like that. The second thing is being able to actually detect and govern that. So a lot of folks will have a way of basically monitoring the certain web pages that are not allowed. That's like an IT-based thing. And then those can be sort of redirected into this same sort of central framework where any monitoring is happening. And then the third, which I highly recommend, honestly, is like keeping up to date with what employees want, and then finding an enterprise grade or business grade solution where you can sign a contract and actually go procure a vendor that gives employees a sort of like release valve, because they really want to use this so much so that they will like, take the steps of like using it, but then like manually trying to scrub out any sort of confidential information. They're just such useful tools that like it's really hard to ban things without having some like sort of viable alternative. And so whatever the sort of like bleeding edges that your sort of team is using, definitely look at like whether there's a way of building a fair sort of like release valve and offshoot that an employee can use. And so we see that a lot where we can have things like IT just have redirects on certain websites that are not sanctioned and redirect them toward the sort of the company sanctioned sort of chat model or image generation model or what have you. So but yes, that sort of central framework can and should work with any of that sort of browser usage as well.
Thanks, Ben. And so Eugene, we've got 2 questions from you, and I'm actually going to go back to your first one. You asked, question about the White House's securing of voluntary commitments from AI companies. Can you talk about how this applies to AI governance? Could the FTC use Section 5 to enforce this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So for folks who don't know, the White House met with several major AI companies and got, I think it was 7 voluntary commitments around AI. These range from things like the commitment to perform cybersecurity risk assessments on their AI systems, to share findings of potential vulnerabilities in their AI systems with the government and with other organizations. I think there was one around agreeing to implement a bug bounty program associated with AI systems. My read on these is some of these are probably sleeves off vest sort of voluntary commitments, where these organizations were likely already doing a lot of this stuff, particularly on the cybersecurity side. The question on whether the FTC could enforce the failure of an organization to do this is an interesting one. I haven't dug into all of the mechanics of how a deceptive practices litigation might unfold in that scenario. But what I would say is, in general, for organizations that make a statement about the type of practice they're engaged in, including a privacy or a security practice, and then they don't follow through with that, put themselves at risk of deceptive practices lawsuit. Now, I think this would extend just to those organizations that have made these voluntary commitments at this point. But it is an interesting question. Again, I doubt that this is going to, that push will come to shove here, because I think that they agreed to things that they felt very confident that they can adhere to.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So we have 1 more minute, and I think I'm going to call it there. But if we didn't get to your questions, please feel free to reach out to us after the fact. We love to talk about this topic, and we love it so much. We are actually hosting an Ask Me Anything AMA on October 11th at 9 a.m. PT. That will be with Ben and then Daniel Goldberg of FKKS, which is a law firm. So thank you so much for being here. Again, we love having you here. And Ben, Brandon, I'll let you say your goodbyes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Morgan. Thank you, Ben. It was a great discussion. I feel like every time we do these, we just scratch the surface of this topic, and we could spend a ton of time digging into the details of governance, but I hope we provided some general guidance and some thoughts around this, and excited to continue the discussion with the community going forward.
Yeah, completely agree. Thank you so much, everybody. This is great. I'm glad we're doing this on a pretty frequent cadence. Obviously, this is changing so rapidly that like every month it's a whole new world. So excited to keep on with sessions like this, and we'll be blogging a lot about this. We'll be kind of all over this topic. So if you aren't already subscribed to our newsletter or on our blog, definitely check it out, because we're very much staying on the beat with this one.